Hi, welcome to Paul and 10. 10 minutes on the Apostle Paul's thinking and 10 episodes, so just one more after this one, for the time being anyway. We're all affected to some degree or another with this pandemic. Some of you may have contracted the virus and been sick. Some of you may have lost loved ones. Many of us have family members putting themselves in danger in a variety of ways, particularly those working in healthcare. My own daughter has been caring for COVID patients in a busy London hospital. And some of us have suffered financially. But for many of us it's been, well, an inconvenience. We're well fed, sheltering comfortably in our homes with no shortage of entertainment while we do so. The people that have suffered most all over the world, on our doorstep, and especially in developing nations, have been the poor. People who live in crowded homes and slum communities, who have no possibility of social distancing, people who depend on working in the homes of the wealthy, who now have no income, people whose main concern is not getting the virus, but starvation. My wife runs an educational charity which works with desperately poor people in India, and some of the stories coming from our partners have been heartbreaking, of families who are only able to eat every other day. Can you imagine? The good news is that there are Christians all over the world working tirelessly, risking their own health to meet the tremendous need, to feed the hungry and to tend to the sick. And that's something that the Church of Jesus Christ has done incessantly since the very beginning. There's much to criticise in the history of the Church, but there have always been Christians who have served the poor and understood that radical love and a commitment to justice is an integral part of the gospel. In AD 65, a devastating epidemic struck the Roman Empire, striking down huge swathes of the populations of the cities, again disproportionately the poor. But it was Christians who heroically nursed the sick, often themselves dying as they did so. But how was it in Paul's day? Paul is often thought of as a great theologian, a thinker, an evangelist. And over the centuries, people have debated his great themes of justification by faith and salvation. But was he particularly interested in the poor? Well, given what we've discovered about Paul's gospel over the past few weeks, I think it would be a surprise to find that Paul didn't believe that a concern for the poor was an integral part of the gospel. The gospel, remember, is the good news that God has broken into the world to reclaim it under the lordship of Christ, to bring in a new day of justice and peace, a new day of renewed people and renewed world. And remember, in Acts, the very first Christians were sharing what they had as any had need. They had a daily distribution of food to the poor widows, and there was not a needy person among them, writes Luke, followed very closely by great grace was upon them all. And you just have to go to the book of James, the leader of the Jerusalem community of Jesus followers, to get some sense of these first believers' view of the world, where the author is utterly scathing about the possibility of being a Jesus follower and denying the poor. And as always, we have to consider Paul's Jewish background, where the God of the Hebrew Scripture stands out as the protector of the poor, and where Israelites were reminded again and again by their prophets that God required them to take care of the disadvantaged, widows, orphans, the poor, and to strive for justice. And of course we remember Jesus' reply to John the Baptist about his own ministry in Matthew's Gospel, and the poor have good news preached to them. And time again in the description of Jesus' ministry, particularly in Luke's Gospel, the poor are highlighted. Remember, for example, Zacchaeus, whose salvation was proclaimed after he had given half his goods to the poor. All of this was Paul's inheritance, so perhaps it should come as no surprise to find in Paul that concern for the poor was an integral part of being a follower of Jesus. Now, Galatians 2. Paul speaks here of his encounter with the other apostles in Jerusalem, where they discussed the scope of the gospel. A point of controversy was whether Gentiles had to become Jewish in order to follow Jesus. Paul, of course, was adamant that this was not the case. And in the end, there was consensus, and James, John and Peter agreed that Paul could take his Torah-free gospel to the Gentiles. But in verse 10, Paul says, only they asked us to remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do. Now, isn't that remarkable? Here, at the conclusion of this major discussion about the very nature of the gospel, Paul thinks it important enough to mention this crucial part of the agreement, that he and Barnabas remember the poor. Not that Paul needed any persuasion on this point. He says it was the very thing he was eager to do. James, John, Peter, Paul all agreed that remembering the poor was an integral part of the gospel. And when we read Paul's letters, it becomes clear that Paul expected concern for the needy to be a hallmark of the groups of Jesus followers to which he wrote. We've thought already in this series about the fact that the vast majority of people in the Roman Empire lived in poverty or near poverty, and how Jesus followers loved and supported each other, forming new communities that testified to the radical love of God. So time and time again we hear Paul urging these believers to care and support for one another, to live in love. And given the difficult lives of most of the people in the churches, it's clear that concern for the poor was high on Paul's agenda. But not only did Paul think believers ought to care for one another, their love needed to spill out to the wider community. In Galatians 6, Paul says, as you have opportunity, do good to everyone. Now this phrase here, to do the good, was in regular use in Paul's world, referring to financial contributions in community life. In 1 Thessalonians 5, Paul says, encourage the faint-hearted, help the weak here including those who are economically vulnerable. In 1 Timothy, Paul refers to the community's support for needy widows. And in Titus 3, Christians are to devote themselves to good works in order to meet pressing needs around them. And if we go to Paul's letter to the Ephesians, we find him urging Jesus followers to work so that they have enough over to share with the needy. And in Romans 12, Paul talks about acts of mercy and says that the Romans need to contribute to the needs of their brothers and sisters, and goes on to say that they are to associate with the lowly. So again and again, along with all the numerous times that Paul urges Christians to live in love, we find his letters peppered with concern for the poor and needy. Now, one of the ways that Paul sought to make good on his promise to remember the poor was the money collection that he mentions on several occasions in his letters in Corinthians, Galatians and Romans. This was a project that was of enormous importance to Paul, which he carried out in the mid-50s. Basically, Paul knew of great need among Jesus' followers in Jerusalem, possibly as a result of famine, and he wanted his Gentile Christians to help. It looks like he drove this fundraising for several years before eventually taking the money to Jerusalem. In Romans we learn that he was worried that danger lay ahead on this trip, and we know from Acts that he was right to be concerned because he ended up being arrested on his return to Judea. This collection then shows just how important meeting the needs of the poor was to Paul, and how far he was willing to risk his own life for the sake of it. Also, what it shows is how generosity was a part of first century faith, because the believers that Paul was collecting from were themselves not well off. How is it that those who are in need themselves are often much more generous than those of us blessed by so much? I remember at times being utterly humbled in visiting people in marginalised communities in India, people who had very, very little, but who brought me food and bottled Coke, which they really couldn't afford, just in order to be hospitable. We can't read Paul's letters without realising that Paul was deeply concerned for the poor, and that his good news about the arrival of God's kingdom through Jesus meant that love and care were to be shared generously both within the Christian community and without. This is not some social gospel. This is an integral part of the gospel. All of which brings a huge challenge to us Jesus followers who are well fed, clothed, sheltered and entertained. The question we face is, how does my life engage with the poor? In what way are we associating with the lowly? How are we contributing to the needs of the saints? Because this is part of the DNA of the gospel. And at a time like this, when brothers and sisters and others all around the world are in need, in some cases starving, in what ways can we become the gospel and remember the poor? This is how we demonstrate to a needy world the reality of our faith and the radical nature of Christ's loving kingdom.